Hey folks, welcome to another photo story episode. And to start off, this is not one of my photographs. This was shot by Paul Strand. And if you're not familiar with who Paul Strand is, he was a photographer from the early 1900s. And one of the things he focused on was sort of the shape and form of objects, the lighting on the objects. He did what they called straight photography, which was just photographing things as they were. But it also kind of has like an abstract sense to it. So his images are what inspired this photo story. So I'm going to start by showing you some of his work, and then I'll show you what I did at the end here. So here's another photograph of his. This table that was rotated on its side. Really nice play on shadows, interesting shape, interesting texture going on there. This last one I'll show you is a couple of, looks like some bowls or something, just kind of laid out there. But again, a really interesting play on shadow and light. And these two images in particular have really stayed in my head for some time. You know, I always wanted to have an excuse to shoot something like this, but strangely enough, really never had the opportunity. So here's where my story begins. I was at Mystic Seaport and I noticed these really great porcelain cups and plates and pitchers and whatnot. And when I saw that, it immediately brought me back to the Paul Strand photos. So I looked at this for a minute and got in a little bit closer and started shooting away, trying to capture that shape and form of the object. So I had this shot here, got in a little tighter to really try to get more abstract, tilted the camera into portrait orientation, which I actually kind of like the direction this one's going in. And here's another shot here, given a little more kind of negative space at the bottom. So in editing the photos, I decided to go black and white. I thought they'd have a little more impact. And I was liking the direction these were going in. However, when I looked at the images as thumbnails, they looked a little more cinematic to me. For some reason, the large images were just really clean. And when I looked at them on my desktop as a thumbnail, it looked a little more interesting. So I did something that I haven't done in a very long time, which is go ahead and sort of grit up the image a little bit. Just muck it up a tad. So I brought it into Analog Effects Pro from DxO, which is part of the old Nik collection. If you're familiar with the Nik collection from several years back, they're now owned by DxO. Analog Effects Pro basically lets you kind of, muck up the images with old sort of film style looks. So here I am just processing some of the photos. You can see the before and after. And eventually, I settled on something that looks kind of like this. It just kind of added a little more antiquing to the image, and I was liking the direction that was going in. And here's the shot we saw earlier. It's a little more gritty. It's got some imperfections on the film. So I'm kind of digging the direction this is going in. Now here's where it gets interesting. At the same time I was working on these images, I was also playing around with lighting inside of 3D software. I was just experimenting, lighting some different objects, and I was doing this right after shooting those images. So they were kind of fresh in my mind. While I was playing around with lighting objects in a 3D environment, I thought I could make some renderings of a teacup and a pitcher and whatnot, and try to sort of mimic the look I was getting with the photographs. So here's one of the first renderings, and it was the same deal. I set it up in the 3D software, I lit it similar to what I remembered those photographs being like, and then I took them into the Analog Effects Pro plugin, and I also ran the same filter over these renderings as I did on the photograph. So here's the first one. So here's another one I did, and I put a picture inside of this scene as well, again totally ripping off what I did in the photograph. Here's another one that was totally ripped off from one of those earlier photographs, even trying to play around a little bit more with the depth of field and blurring that foreground picture out a little bit. It's really weird because normally when you're taking photographs, there's certain key things you're always trying to get right, like the perfect focus, a really sharp, clean image. And in doing these 3D renderings, I had to take all that stuff that I tried to get so perfect and reverse engineer it and kind of do it backwards, like make the depth of field off just a little bit, grit up the image, actually soften the rendering because the rendering comes out so clean and so perfect. There's actually a very subtle blur applied to this whole image just to make it look so not computer generated. Then I realized I had the freedom to move the camera wherever I wanted. So here's a shot from above. And then I started to experiment a little bit with color. And again, all these images have gone through that Analog Effects Pro just to add that slight level of wash or grit to it. And then here's one of the final images right here, again in color, an overhead shot. And it all started with these inspirational images done by Paul Strand, moving on to trying to capture those images myself, add a little more grit to give it some visual interest, and then taking all that information and putting it into a computer-generated rendering, which I thought was just a really interesting approach to doing this. So that wraps up this photo story. If you'd like to see more, you can check out the links below.